Welcome back to Nonfiction for Life, the podcast with authors who write compelling true stories and books with great ideas for living well. I'm your host, Janet Perry, and today we'll be talking to Erica Komisar, author of Being There, Why Prioritizing Motherhood in the First 3 Years Matters. Before I introduce Erica, let me point out that every time we start the podcast, we remind you that our books include compelling true stories, which are biographies and memoirs, and books with great ideas for living well. And that includes books about business and entrepreneurship, community building, health and wellness, home and family, and personal development. Today, I'm so pleased to announce that this will be our first podcast about home and family. And now we'll have a podcast in every category. So at the end of the program, when we say there's something for everyone, we really mean it. And we hope that you're finding something that is interesting to you. If you like the podcast and are enjoying the stories and the ideas that you're getting, please leave a review in the podcast. We're trying to get to 50 reviews by the end of the year. And now let me introduce Erica. She's a licensed clinical social worker, psychoanalyst, and parent guidance expert who's been in private practice in New York City for the last 25 years. She graduated from Georgetown and Columbia University, as well as the New York Freudian Society. She's a psychological consultant, bringing parenting and work-life workshops to clinics, schools, corporations, and childcare settings, including the Garden House School, Goldman Sachs, Shearman and Sterling, and SWFS Early Childhood Center. She lives in New York City with her husband, optometrist and social entrepreneur, Dr. Jordan Cassillo, and their 3 teenage children. We're really pleased Erica would take time to talk to us today about her book, Being There, Why Prioritizing Motherhood in the First 3 Years Matters. Welcome to the program, Erica. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
First of all, your book came out about 6 months ago, and today it's sold out on Amazon. So what are we to make of that, and what's been the public's reaction to the book so far?
Well, when it came out 6 months ago, it was well received, but it was well received by a certain amount of the population and not all of the population, meaning it was really refused by a lot of the liberal media, unfortunately. Places that should have reviewed it based on having such a big publisher like New York Times and Washington Post actually refused to publish any reviews. But I was able to, in spite of that, I was on a lot of morning shows and did a lot of radio and, made some impact. But it wasn't until the Wall Street Journal piece, which just came out on last Saturday, that it's really reached a larger audience both nationally and internationally. It's the content is difficult for people. It's as my rabbi has said many times, Erica, just keep telling the truth, even though the truth is painful for people. And I keep that as my mantra in my head because, the article in the Wall Street Journal was about the politicizing of my message, that people from the far left viewed it as some kind of anti-feminist message when it wasn't meant that way. It's really not a political message. It's a human message. It's a message about what children need in the first 3 years to develop and what we're depriving them of, and also what we're depriving ourselves of as mothers in those first 3 years. Because, when babies aren't happy, mothers really in the end aren't happy either.
In the front of the book, you place 3 quotes from people that seem to set the stage for so much of the message you're trying to convey. Let's read the first 2. The first one's from C.S. Lewis, which says, "Children are not a distraction from more important work. They are the most important work." And the second one is Jesse Jackson. You quote him saying, "Your children need your presence more than your presence." So let's talk about that. You dedicate a lot of the book to what it means to be a present mother. So tell us what that is, what that looks like, and why she's so vital to her baby.
Well, first I'll say that I really wrote this book in part because I felt we had devalued mothering, that we had forgotten how important mothers are to babies and society. and that mothering was considered less important, less valuable work in society. So, as C.S. Lewis says, raising emotionally healthy human beings that you send out into the world. And if that's your legacy, that is the most important legacy. Aristotle's deathbed question of, when you're lying on your deathbed, are you going to think about all the promotions you didn't get, or the money you didn't have, or the material success you didn't have? Or are you going to, be grateful that the person sitting next to you as you're dying are the people that love you and that you've given to? So, I think we've lost our way kind of as a society, in that we overvalue things like professional achievement and material success and money and status. And we really undervalue probably the most important things in life, which are relationships. My mission was to help society and women in particular understand that they are not just, how should I say it? They're not a luxury item. They're actually a necessity to children's. They're biologically necessary. And when I started to write this book about 12 years ago, I had very young children, and I decided to put off the writing of the book because I realized that writing this book, even though it was critical to write, would take me away from my children. So when they really needed me and they were really little. And I obviously, as a psychoanalyst and a parent guidance expert, I understood the importance of the brain development in those early years. But I started looking at the research because in my practice, as I said, which is primarily a parent guidance practice, I was seeing this increase in mental disorders in children, very young children at a very young age, being diagnosed earlier and earlier with these mental disorders like ADHD and aggression and behavioral problems and social disorders, and many of them just being medicated to get rid of the symptoms, and society not looking at what was causing the symptoms. And in my practice, I was seeing the connection between the absence of mothers on a daily basis in children's lives and the increase in these mental disorders. And that's when I started looking at the research, and then became rather obsessed with the research for about 12 years, looking at neuroscience and epigenetics and attachment research, which kind of backed up what I was seeing. And then I said, gosh, I'm on a mission. I'm going to write a book about this. And what the research shows is that, as I said, mothers are biologically necessary to the right or social, emotional brain development of children in the first 3 years. They do a few really critical things. First, they help to regulate children's emotions from moment to moment, from the outside. After 3 years, children can then internalize the ability to regulate their own emotions. And what regulation means is essentially that mothers, when they comfort a child who's in distress from moment to moment, they're actually keeping their child's emotions from going too high or too low and bringing them back to what we call homeostasis. And mothers do that from moment to moment all day long, comfort a baby in distress and bring them back to homeostasis. It's only through that constant kind of moment-to-moment process that human beings, who will be adult human beings, learn to actually regulate their emotions. So what we're seeing in society is this increase in emotional regulation issues, even in adults, depression, anxiety, where both children and adolescents and adults are not able to regulate their emotions. And then the other thing that mothers do from a biological level is they buffer children from stress. So, the big buzzword in society today is resilience to stress. How do we build it? Well, it happens in the first 3 years. It's through mothers buffering children from stress in the first 3 years that children after that 3-year period internalize the ability to buffer themselves, basically to be resilient to bad things that happen, to be resilient to stress. We're not born stress resilient. It's developed through that protection from stress from moment to moment that mothers do. And what we understand in the research now is that babies are born much more neurologically fragile than we knew before. They are born, some theorists believe, 9 to 18 months too soon from a neurological level. Mothers in the first 9 months are essentially a baby's central nervous system. And so now imagine that 27% of American mothers have to or want to go back to work after 2 weeks. When the baby isn't even fully awake, probably not fully bonded, and the mother isn't even fully healed from giving birth. So yeah, Houston, we have a problem.
You use that word bonding, and that's one we're familiar with. You use bonding and secure attachment, and maybe you can help us understand the difference between the two or how they're related and why these are so important.
So they're confused often as being the same thing. So bonding happens in the very beginning between mothers and babies, or it doesn't happen. And things like stress can interfere with bonding between mothers and babies. But bonding is the thing that we think of that happens when the baby is born and the baby suckles for the first time. And, but attachment takes up to 3 years. Attachment is associated with emotional security. So think of attachment as the reinforcement of bonding over and over and over again for those 3 years. It's mothers being physically and emotionally present enough that children can rely on mothers, as I said, to buffer their stress and regulate their emotions, but to provide them with a kind of emotional security that they can go back and refuel with over and over again. So there is a difference between bonding and attachment. And what we're seeing is that because stress can interfere with bonding, it also interferes with breastfeeding. There's many, many, many mothers who try to breastfeed, but what they don't understand is there's an inverse relationship between oxytocin, which is the love hormone, which increases breast milk production. We produce it when we give birth, and we produce it when we breastfeed. But because cortisol, which is the stress hormone, has an inverse reaction to oxytocin, when we feel stressed, our oxytocin levels go down and our breast milk production goes down. So there's many mothers saying, I just didn't produce enough breast milk. I just didn't produce. And what they don't understand is that stress reduces breast milk production. And mothers are having babies already stressed about having them, stressed with them, stressed about leaving them, even when they're in the hospital, knowing they only have, we say there's conscious stress and there's deeply unconscious stress. So if you know you have to go back to work in 12 weeks, why should you get deeply connected to this baby if you're going to have to leave the baby in 12 weeks? So it's a barrier really for women to be attached to their babies, knowing that they're going to have to leave them very soon.
That's a heavy burden. Maybe to explain just how connected the baby is, I'd love you to share the analogy that you use in the book between a boat tied to a dock in rough waters.
So think about the mother as the dock, right? And so what you're doing when you build that emotional security in a child is you're basically providing them with the stability, the emotional center to come back to again and again. And what happens is, as children, we internalize what we call internal representations of mothers. We basically internalize our mothers. We all walk around with two mothers all the time. We walk around with our real mother, who we can call and talk to wherever she is, and maybe, or we can go and visit. And then we walk around, more importantly, with our internal representation of our mother, which is when we need to summon up comfort in our lives, whether we're children or adolescents or adults, we summon up our mothers. And if our mothers were present enough emotionally and physically and sensitive as nurturers and empathic towards us, that's what we summon up when we're under stress, and that comforts us and soothes us. If our mothers were absent or distracted or depressed or disinterested in mothering or ambivalent about us or resentful, then that's what we summon up. So what we say is that mothering is passed down generationally, not just on an emotional level, but also on a biological level. There's so much research to show that there's a man named Michael Meany who did research about the fact that rats that he tested, if they licked and groomed their young, meaning if they were sensitive nurturers to their young, their babies turned out to be more resilient to stress in the long run, as opposed to the babies who weren't nurtured sensitively by their mothers, who were much less resilient to stress. And also, he found that the licking and grooming was passed down generationally to the daughters of those only who were licked and groomed.
That's really interesting. Okay, well, you make a really good case for the fact that mothers were intended to be with their children from the beginning and through these first 3 years. And you cite a lot of research, which I turn our listeners to in the book. But in the course of normal life, babies and mothers will separate, even if it's just time for the mother to take a shower in those early weeks and months. And in the book, you, besides making the case for mothers needing to be there, you give a lot of ideas to mothers of how to handle all the decisions that have to be made when they have a new baby. And one of them is dealing with transitions. So these separations come, and you say, just to understand the child, you say the most painful times for young children are the comings and goings of their mothers. And so I feel like one of the most important sections of the book is this section on transitions. So what are some of those daily transitions that mothers can count on, and what ideas can help make them smoother?
So with all children, transitions are important, even more critical for what we call sensitive children. Children who are born sensitive, we're finding more and more children are being born genetically sensitive. And what that means is they come out constitutionally more sensitive to noise, more sensitive to touch or lack thereof, more sensitive to a mother's separation. Sometimes we call them colicky babies. They're more difficult to soothe when they're in distress. And we have many, many more babies being born with this genetic sensitivity. A researcher named Grazia Kocinska found that many, many babies are being born with what we call a short allele on the serotonin receptor. And serotonin is the thing that we need to allow us to feel happiness and to hold on to happiness. And so what she found is many babies are being born with this sensitivity, and then a maternally sensitive approach to those babies neutralizes the expression of that gene. So those babies have as great a chance of becoming emotionally healthy as a baby that isn't sensitive. But all babies need help with transitions, but sensitive babies even more so. So I'll preface it by saying that and say that transitions are critical. What are transitions? The most important transitions for babies are going to sleep and waking up. Because when we go to sleep, we go unconscious, and it's the scariest thing in the world for babies and children. It's even scary for some adults. When I do parenting seminars, the first thing I ask when I'm talking about this subject is I ask parents, adults, are you scared of the dark? And most of them sit there and keep their hands down and put their head down and are afraid to admit to it. And then I tell them the story of, if you're in a cabin in the woods with your husband and it's pitch black outside and you have to make a fire and the wood's outside, would you volunteer to go? So, because it's what we project into the dark too, as we get to be toddlers. We have a lot of fears of aggression and very intense feelings. So, right, transitions, particularly going to sleep and waking up, are critical, that mothers are sensitive and there at those points. The other transitions might be, as you said, mothers can't be with babies every single second. I mean, mothers have never historically been with babies every single second. Having said that, when babies are really little in other parts of the world, babies don't cry nearly as much as they do here. The research shows babies in America and in Western cultures cry and are in distress much more than babies in other parts of the world, where mothers wear the babies on their bodies. And in fact, Jane Goodall was interviewed the other day for her documentary that was made about her, and she said the same thing about her research with chimps, which is baby chimps are never in distress. They never have to cry and get fraught when they're really little, because they're always on their mother's body, and they'll pull on her hair and make a little sound, and the mother will comfort them. And it's the skin-to-skin contact, we know, that produces the oxytocin in mothers and babies and comforts the baby and soothes the baby. So it's touch and eye contact and voice. And so if you're holding your baby, and you're wearing your baby essentially, your baby isn't getting into states of distress, right? So yeah, transitions. If you have to go to the bathroom or take a shower, believe it or not, you have to repair that absence, even if it's for a few minutes. If you go to the supermarket and you leave your baby with someone, or if you go to work and you come back, there's a whole chapter in the book about how to repair the separation. So I make an analogy in the book about, when you get a little hole in your sweater, a little pull in your sweater. If you don't repair that pull right away, at least this is what my mother taught me, and I believe it's true. If you don't repair that pull right away, the pull gets bigger and bigger, and then there's a big hole in the sweater, and then you can't repair it anymore. But if you repair the pull in the sweater, each time there's a pull in the sweater becomes stronger as a result. And so think of it like that whether you're going to take a shower and you're gone for 10 minutes, or whether you're gone for 6 hours to go to work, you still have to do a kind of repair when you return. And what that means is a lot of mothers, particularly mothers who work, because again, this is not a book that says you can't work. It's not a book for, it doesn't say you have to be a stay-at-home mom, but what it says is whether you're a stay-at-home mom or a working mom, you have to prioritize your children and be as present physically and emotionally as possible. That's what the book says. And many mothers have to work. They support their families, and there's realities to life. And in our country, we don't have a maternity leave policy that really supports mothers and babies to be together, which is one of the reasons I wrote this book. Because if we have a biological necessity of this, and if it's harming society overall, then it makes a very good argument for why we need a maternity leave policy. But, we don't have one. Many mothers have to work, and therefore, when they come back in from work, I think there's a misunderstanding because they feel badly they've been away, because they can't bear to see the sadness and the anger in their baby's eyes. They'll come in with a big smile on their face, saying, "Hi, how are you? Mommy's so happy to be home," with a big smile. Rather than looking at the baby, rather than seeing what the baby is feeling and reflecting that feeling, which actually makes the baby feel seen and then repairs that little pull in the sweater. If you see your baby is sad, then saying, "I'm sorry, Mommy was away today, and I was so sad too to be away from you." If you see them angry, saying, "It's okay to be angry. Mommy was away. It's okay." Right? So there's a real difference between us looking at our babies and walking in and reflecting what they feel versus bringing all our guilt to them in a way that isn't sensitive to their emotions. So yeah, that's a transition, the comings and the goings. And I say, if you're a working mom, try to remember that once out, once in is better for babies than out and in and out and in, even though mothers think that's better because they get to see their baby in between. In fact, it's really traumatic for babies when you go out and you come in. So you want to limit it to once a day if you can. Sometimes it's not possible. But yeah.
Well, there are, mothers go into motherhood probably naive, all of us. We're told that there's going to be sacrifices, which is something you bring up in the book that isn't discussed very often. And we're also told, new mothers are told, it's never going to be the same, but we don't really know what that looks like. We don't know what the sacrifices feel like. And so knowing what you know, what ideas can you share that will help make that experience of being a new mother more realistic of a change for them?
I think we do have a problem because I think we don't educate women very young when we need to about the fact that, in fact, you don't have to have children as a woman. This isn't the 50s. We don't have to have children to lead satisfying lives. We can have lives without children and live have linear careers like men do often. You don't have to have children to be happy. But if you do have children, it requires what I take from the Torah, really, as a faithful Jewish person. I take from the Torah a Hebrew term, which is Yisarei Ahava, which means our sacred obligation to care for our children above everything else. And basically that means prioritizing our children, translated into English. And, it is important to educate young women that, if they're going to have children, it's going to require them making sacrifices. It's going to require them maybe having a less linear career and being prepared for that. And also that you can do everything in life, but you just can't do it all at the same time. And life is long. And if we live as long as they tell us we're going to live, which is, till we're like Moses and 120 or whatever, of our healthcare system getting better and science, and then what's the rush? Because you have this very short